April 28th, 1122. The Thracian plain near the city of Beroia, modern-day Stara Zagora in Bulgaria. 480 Varangian guardsmen stood in formation, their breath misting in the cold morning air, watching the horizon. Before them, stretching as far as the eye could see, was a sea of felt tents, wagons, livestock and warriors. Tens of thousands of Pecheneg nomads, perhaps as many as 80,000, had crossed the Danube and invaded Byzantine territory. These were not simple raiders. This was an entire nation on the move, and they had come for war. The Varangians, elite foreigners in Byzantine service, gripped their Danish axes tighter as they observed the enemy camp. Most were Norsemen from Scandinavia, with a growing number of Anglo-Saxons who had fled England after the Norman conquest 56 years earlier. They wore the finest Byzantine lamella and mail armour, but carried the weapons of their homelands. Two-handed axes with hafts reaching 5 feet in length, topped by broad crescent blades that could split a man from shoulder to hip in a single stroke. Standing among them was Emperor John II Komnenos himself, 24 years old, recently crowned, and facing the first major military crisis of his reign. His father, the legendary Alexios I, had crushed a Pecheneg invasion 31 years earlier at the Battle of Livunion, slaughtering over 100,000 nomads in what should have been their final defeat. But some had survived, scattered, regrouped. Now they had returned, stronger than before, seeking revenge and plunder. John had been campaigning successfully against the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia when word reached him of the invasion. He immediately recalled his army from the east, but there had not been time to bring the full field force. He had perhaps 8,000 men total, 3,000 guardsmen and elite Tagmata units from Constantinople, 5,000 thematic troops hastily raised from Thrace. Against them, the Pechenegs numbered 10 to 1. The mathematics were impossible. The Byzantines should have waited for reinforcements, should have fallen back to fortified positions, should have done anything except face this horde in open battle. But John understood something his advisors did not. The Pechenegs were overconfident. They had defeated smaller Byzantine forces in recent skirmishes. They believed the empire weak, the new emperor untested, and overconfidence created opportunity. For 3 days John had played diplomat. He sent envoys bearing gifts of gold and silk. He offered favourable terms for a treaty. He suggested the Pechenegs could settle peacefully in imperial territory, receive trading rights, be granted lands in return for military service. The Pecheneg chiefs, gathering in their great wagon fortress, debated the offer. Some were tempted. Others suspected a trap. All believed they held the advantage. What none of them realised was that John was buying time to study their camp layout, time to position his troops, time to prepare an assault that would shatter their nation forever. The Pechenegs were masters of steppe warfare. They fought as horse archers primarily, riding small, hardy ponies that could survive on minimal forage. Each warrior carried a powerful composite bow, capable of penetrating mail armour at close range. They would attack in waves, raining arrows from a distance, then retreating before infantry could close. When the enemy formation broke under the arrow storm, Pecheneg lancers would charge in for the kill, their long spears punching through weakened lines. Against conventional infantry, these tactics were devastating. Byzantine scutatoi, armoured spearmen with large shields, could form shield walls that resisted arrow fire, but they were too slow to catch the mobile nomads. If they advanced, the Pechenegs simply rode away, peppering them with arrows from a safe distance until they broke formation or exhausted themselves. If they held position, the Pechenegs could circle around them, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Pecheneg wagon fortress, called a lager, was their tactical centre. Hundreds of heavy wagons were drawn into a massive circle, wheels chained together, creating a wooden wall miles in circumference. Inside this barrier, the Pechenegs kept their families, livestock, food supplies, and arrow reserves. Warriors could ride out to attack, then retreat behind the wagons if pressed. The lager was both fortress and mobile city, allowing the nomads to remain indefinitely in enemy territory. Breaking a wagon fortress required either siege equipment, which the Byzantines did not have, or infantry willing to advance directly into concentrated arrow fire, climb over or hack through the wagons, and fight in brutal close combat against defenders who had nothing left to lose. Few armies were willing to pay that price. but John had the Varangian Guard, and the Varangians did not calculate costs, they calculated victories. The assault began at dawn on the 28th of April. John's archers and light infantry moved forward first, engaging the Pecheneg horse archers who swarmed out of the laager like angry hornets. Arrows darkened the sky. Men fell on both sides. The Pechenegs, expecting the Byzantines to break under this barrage as previous forces had done, pressed their attack. Then the Byzantine cavalry struck from both flanks. Cataphractoi, heavily armoured lancers on armoured horses, smashed into the Pecheneg formations from two directions simultaneously. The nomads, caught between infantry and cavalry, took heavy casualties, but they did not break. They were too experienced, too skilled. They disengaged, reforming behind their wagon fortress. John pressed the attack. His infantry advanced, shields locked, pushing the Pechenegs back toward their laager. The nomads fought a fighting retreat, loosing arrows continuously, trying to inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own forces. Byzantine soldiers fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. But the advance continued. The Pechenegs reached their wagons and took position behind them. Now the Byzantines faced the true test. The wagon walls bristled with archers, thousands of composite bows aimed at the advancing troops. To continue forward meant walking into a killing zone where arrows would fall like hail. John himself led from the front, riding along the battle line to inspire his troops. An arrow struck him in the leg, punching through his armour and lodging in muscle. Blood poured down his greaves. His officers begged him to withdraw, to seek medical attention. He refused. He had his leg bound where he sat in the saddle and continued directing the battle. If the emperor could fight through his wounds, how could any soldier consider retreat? The Byzantine infantry reached the wagon line and tried to force their way through. The Pechenegs fought with desperate fury. Spears thrust between wagon wheels, axes hacked at men trying to climb over, arrows fired at point-blank range. The Byzantine advance stalled. Men were dying in heaps at the base of the wagons, but they could not break through. This was the moment John had prepared for. This was why he had brought the Varangian Guard. The Varangians had been held in reserve, positioned behind the main battle line. Now they moved forward, 480 axe-bearing warriors marching in tight formation. They did not run. They did not charge. They simply walked toward the wagon fortress with the inevitability of a glacier. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were elite foreign mercenaries, selected for their size, strength, and skill. Most stood over 6 feet tall, in an era when the average man barely reached 5.5. They wore layered armour that weighed 60 pounds or more, mail hauberks that covered them from neck to knee, lamellar cuirasses over the mail for additional protection, steel helmets with face guards, heavy leather gloves reinforced with metal plates, and they carried their axes. The Danish long axe was not a tool. It was a purpose-built weapon of war. The haft was ashwood, dense and flexible, cut to a length that matched the warrior's height. 5 feet was typical. The blade was forge-welded steel, broad and thin, ground to a razor edge along a cutting surface that measured 18 inches or more. The entire weapon weighed perhaps 8 pounds, but in the hands of a trained warrior it could generate incredible force. The mechanics of the Danish axe were brutal physics. The long haft acted as a lever, magnifying the force of the swing. The thin blade concentrated that force onto a narrow edge. When the axe struck, it delivered thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch, enough to shear through iron, split bone, cut completely through a human torso. But these were not wild berserker weapons. The Varangians trained extensively in axe combat. They understood timing, distance, footwork. They knew how to fight in formation, each man supporting his brothers. They practiced techniques passed down through generations of Norse warriors. How to use the axe's hook to pull down shields, how to strike from unexpected angles, how to transition from long swings to close grappling, how to fight when wounded, when exhausted, when death seemed certain. The Varangian Guard reached the wagon line where the Byzantine infantry had stalled. Without hesitation they went to work. The first rank stepped forward and swung their axes in synchronized arcs. The blades bit into the wagon wood with sounds like thunder. Oak planks, thick enough to stop arrows, split under the impacts. The Varangians pulled their axes free and swung again, and again. They worked with methodical precision, each warrior targeting a specific section of wagon, cutting through it stroke by stroke. The Pechenegs shot arrows into them at point-blank range. The Varangians did not stop. Arrows struck their armour and skittered off. Some found gaps in the protection, punching into shoulders, legs, arms. The wounded warriors shifted their axes to one hand, continuing to fight. One Varangian took an arrow through his cheek that pinned his mouth shut. He broke off the shaft, spat blood and teeth, and kept swinging. The wagons began to come apart. The Varangians did not try to climb over them, they destroyed them. When a wagon section was sufficiently weakened, multiple warriors would hook their axe blades into it and pull together, their combined strength tearing the wagon apart. Wheels collapsed, axles snapped. The wooden walls that had seemed impregnable were methodically demolished. The Pechenegs fought back with increasing desperation. Warriors jumped down from the wagons to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They discovered too late that this was exactly what the Varangians wanted. In close combat, the Danish axe was without equal. The long reach meant Varangians could strike before an opponent with sword or spear could close distance. The heavy blade cut through Pecheneg shields, often taking the arm behind the shield along with it. The hook on the back of the blade could catch an enemy's weapon or armour, pulling him off balance and into a killing blow. One Byzantine chronicler recorded that a single Varangian could face multiple opponents simultaneously due to the axe's reach and power. A warrior would strike one enemy on his right with a wide horizontal swing, then immediately reverse and strike another on his left with the backswing. The axe's momentum, once started, was difficult to stop, so warriors learned to chain multiple attacks together, spinning with the weapon, each revolution bringing death. The Pechenegs had never faced anything like this. They were accustomed to fighting light infantry, to opponents who could be worn down with arrows and mobility. The Varangians were the opposite of everything they understood, heavily armoured, willing to absorb punishment, advancing relentlessly, killing with mechanical efficiency. As the first sections of the wagon wall collapsed, more Byzantine infantry poured through the gaps. But it was the Varangians who led the way, axes rising and falling, clearing paths through the defending Pechenegs. The sound of combat was overwhelming. Axes striking armour, men screaming, horses shrieking as they were cut down, the crack of breaking wood, the wet sounds of edged weapons cutting flesh. Emperor John, still in his saddle despite his wound, ordered the cavalry to circle the Lega and attack from the rear. The Pechenegs, focused on the frontal assault, suddenly found themselves pressed from two directions. Their defensive formation began to collapse. The Varangians pushed deeper into the wagon fortress. They fought their way through the outer ring of defences into the heart of the Pecheneg camp. Here were the families, the non-combatants, the supplies that sustained the nomad army. Here were the arrow stores, the food stocks, the livestock. The Pechenegs realised their position was hopeless. Some warriors threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fought to the death, determined to take as many enemies as possible before they fell. Still others tried to flee, but the Byzantine cavalry had surrounded the entire Lager. There was nowhere to run. Nikitas Choniets, the Byzantine chronicler who recorded this battle, wrote that the wagon folk fell by the thousands. He described the scene as a bloodbath, with the Varangians cutting through the Pecheneg defenders like farmers harvesting wheat. The Byzantine soldiers poured into the camp, and the organised battle dissolved into a chaotic slaughter. The Varangian Guard's role in the battle was critical. They had broken the wagon fortress that conventional troops could not penetrate. They had absorbed the arrows and counterattacks without breaking. They had cut a path that allowed the entire Byzantine army to follow. Without them, the assault would have failed. The casualties were staggering. More than 10,000 Pecheneg warriors were killed. The Pecheneg chieftain and 11 sub-chiefs were captured. Thousands more were taken prisoner. Women, children, and elderly members of the tribe were seized as captives. The Byzantine soldiers looted the camp, taking everything of value. Gold, silver, weapons, armour, horses, livestock. Even the wagons themselves were claimed as spoils. Emperor John distributed portions of the loot to his troops immediately, rewarding them for their sacrifice and ensuring their loyalty. The Varangians, as elite troops, received premium shares, but more valuable than gold was what they had proven, that they could break any defence, that they could stand against any enemy, that they were worth every coin of their substantial salaries. The victory at Beroia effectively destroyed the Pechenegs as an independent people. Some survivors were enrolled in the Byzantine army, following the empire's long tradition of converting defeated enemies into loyal soldiers. Others were dispersed throughout Byzantine territories, settled in depopulated regions where they could be controlled and monitored. The Pecheneg threat, which had plagued the empire for over a century, ended in a single day of brutal combat. But to understand why this victory mattered, why the Varangian Guard's performance was so significant, we need to understand the world they operated in. The Byzantine Empire in 1122 was fighting for survival. 2 generations earlier, in 1071, the Byzantines had suffered their worst military disaster at Manzikert. The Emperor Romanos IV had been captured by the Seljuk Turks, and the professional Byzantine army had been destroyed. The Varangian Guard at Manzikert had fought to the last man, surrounded and annihilated while protecting their emperor. That generation of Varangians had died heroically but uselessly. The empire had nearly collapsed. Anatolia, the heartland that provided the majority of Byzantine soldiers and taxes, fell to Turkish invaders. Civil wars erupted as rival generals fought for the throne. Norman adventurers invaded Byzantine territory in Italy and the Balkans. The empire's territory shrank to a fraction of its former extent. Alexios I Komnenos had stabilized the situation through brilliant diplomacy and careful military rebuilding. He had reformed the army, recruited new mercenary units, established the Komnenian system that would sustain the empire for another century. But the empire he passed to his son John was still vulnerable. The Seljuks controlled most of Anatolia. The Normans held southern Italy. The Crusader states occupied Syria and Palestine. Enemies surrounded Byzantium on all sides. The Pecheneg invasion threatened to unravel everything Alexios had achieved. If they had succeeded, if they had penetrated deeper into Byzantine territory, they could have sparked rebellions, encouraged other enemies to attack, possibly triggered the empire's final collapse. John's victory at Beroia prevented that catastrophe. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Byzantine military reforms were working, that a young, relatively inexperienced emperor could lead his army to victory against overwhelming odds, that Byzantine discipline and tactics, combined with elite mercenary forces like the Varangian Guard, could defeat any enemy. The Varangian Guard itself had an unusual origin story. In 988, Vladimir I of Kiev had sent 6,000 Rus warriors to Emperor Basil II as part of a military aid agreement. Basil, who had just survived a rebellion and was deeply suspicious of his native Byzantine guards, recognized that foreign mercenaries had no local political loyalties. They could not be bribed by rival factions. They had no relatives in Constantinople who might pressure them to betray the emperor. They served purely for gold and honor. Basil formed these Rus warriors into his personal bodyguard and gave them a special status. They received higher pay than any other soldiers. They were housed in barracks next to the imperial palace. They had access to the emperor at all times. They were exempt from regular military discipline, answering only to the emperor himself and their own elected officers. In return, they swore an oath of absolute loyalty. The word Varangian itself comes from the Old Norse term for oath man or sworn man. Once they took service in the guard, they were bound to protect the emperor with their lives, to obey his commands without question, to serve until death or retirement. Breaking this oath was considered the worst dishonour imaginable. The guard quickly earned a reputation for both ferocity and trustworthiness. They fought in Basil's brutal campaigns against the Bulgarians, where they helped win the victory at Cleidion in 1014 that earned Basil the epithet Bulgar Slayer. They served as shock troops in siege warfare. They formed the rear guard during retreats, holding off pursuing enemies while the main army escaped. They also guarded the imperial treasury and the sacred relics of Constantinople. They stood watch at the palace gates. They accompanied the emperor during religious ceremonies and state functions. They were present at all imperial audiences, standing silently with their axes, a visible reminder of the emperor's power. Their reputation was such that Byzantine citizens simply called them the axe-bearers. The Greek term was pelakiphoroi, axe-wielder. Byzantine writers rarely used the word Varangian. They wrote of the axe-bearing barbarians, emphasizing both the foreign origin and the signature weapon. The weapons themselves were objects of fascination and fear. Byzantine citizens had never seen anything like the Danish long axe. Byzantine military tradition emphasized the spear and sword. The axe was considered a tool, not a proper weapon. Yet these northern barbarians wielded axes that could cut a man in half, that could split shields, that could cleave through the finest armour. The Varangians trained constantly with their axes. They practiced in the courtyards of Constantinople, drawing crowds of spectators who watched in awe as the massive warriors went through their combat drills. They would strike wooden posts repeatedly, developing the muscle memory and conditioning needed to swing an 8-pound weapon for hours. They practiced footwork, learning to move quickly despite their heavy armour. They sparred with each other using blunted practice axes, developing timing and distance judgment. They also developed specialised techniques for fighting in formation. Unlike the wild axe warriors of popular imagination, the Varangians fought with tight discipline. They would advance in ranks, the front rank with axes ready, the second rank with axes raised, the third rank ready to step forward when the front ranks tired. When they attacked, they would swing in coordinated strikes. The sound of dozens of axes striking simultaneously was terrifying. The psychological impact on enemies was immense. Imagine facing a line of armoured giants, all swinging massive axes in perfect unison, each strike capable of killing instantly. Few armies had the discipline to stand against such an assault. The Guard's composition changed significantly after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings destroyed the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Many English nobles refused to submit to Norman rule. They fled England, seeking new homes and employment. Thousands of them eventually made their way to Constantinople, where they joined the Varangian Guard. By 1122, when the Battle of Beroia was fought, the Guard was increasingly English in composition. The Norse element remained strong, but it was augmented by Anglo-Saxons and Anglo-Danes, who brought their own military traditions. The English Varangians preferred double-bladed battle axes rather than the single-edged Danish style, but both types were equally effective. This English influx brought new energy to the Guard. The English warriors were desperate to prove themselves, to rebuild their honour after the defeat at Hastings. They fought with a ferocity that impressed even the veteran Norse Varangians. They were loyal to the Byzantine Emperor because he represented everything William the Conqueror opposed. Serving Byzantium was their revenge against Norman conquest. At Beroia, many of the Varangians were likely these English exiles, men who had lost everything, who fought for the Byzantine Emperor because they had no homeland left to defend. This might explain the particular brutality of the Guard's assault on the Pecheneg wagon fortress. They were not just fighting for pay, they were fighting to prove they still mattered, that defeat in England had not broken them. The tactical employment of the Varangian Guard at Beroia demonstrated John II's military acumen. He did not waste his elite troops in preliminary skirmishing. He held them in reserve until the critical moment. When the Byzantine advance stalled against the wagon fortress, when it seemed the assault might fail, only then did he commit the Varangians. This was proper use of a strategic reserve. Elite troops are too valuable to expend early in battle. They should be used to exploit opportunities, to break through at decisive points, to turn the tide at critical moments. John understood this principle perfectly. He also understood the Varangian Guard's specific capabilities. They were not cavalry. They could not chase down fleeing enemies or conduct rapid manoeuvres. They were heavy infantry, specialised in brutal close combat. The wagon fortress was the perfect target for them. It was a static defence that required overwhelming close-range power to break. That was exactly what the Varangians provided. The cost in Varangian casualties is not recorded in detail, but it must have been significant. Advancing into concentrated arrow fire, then hacking through wooden fortifications while under attack, then fighting hand-to-hand against desperate defenders, the Varangians would have taken heavy losses. Some historians estimate that perhaps a third of the Guard engaged at Beroia were killed or seriously wounded, but the survivors earned glory that would be remembered for generations. They had accomplished what was thought impossible. They had broken a Pecheneg wagon fortress, something that had never been done before. They had destroyed an enemy that had threatened the empire for over a century. They had proven once again that they were worth every gold coin of their substantial salaries. The aftermath of Beroia was as important as the battle itself. John did not simply celebrate victory and march home. He understood that military success had to be translated into political advantage. He immediately began negotiating with the Pecheneg prisoners. Some were offered enrolment in the Byzantine army. This was not mercy. This was practical policy. The Byzantines constantly needed soldiers. Converting defeated enemies into loyal troops was more efficient than killing them all. Many Pechenegs accepted, preferring Byzantine service to execution or slavery. Others were settled in depopulated regions of Anatolia, which had been devastated by Turkish raids over the previous 50 years. These Pecheneg settlers would help rebuild the agricultural base, provide new taxpayers, and serve as a population buffer against future invasions. They were closely monitored to prevent rebellion, but generally they integrated successfully into Byzantine society within a generation. The Pecheneg chiefs were treated differently. Some were executed as examples, others were imprisoned. The most cooperative were given minor positions in Byzantine service, but always under close supervision. John could not allow them to retain enough influence to organise resistance. He also erected a massive victory monument at Beroia, commemorating the battle and honouring the soldiers who had fought there. The Varangian Guard was specifically mentioned, recognising their critical role. This monument served multiple purposes. It celebrated Byzantine victory, it intimidated future enemies, and it reinforced John's legitimacy as emperor. The strategic consequences of Beroia were enormous. With the Pecheneg threat eliminated, John could turn his attention back to Anatolia and the Seljuk Turks. Over the next 2 decades, he would conduct a series of successful campaigns that recovered much of western Anatolia for the empire. He would restore Byzantine control of crucial cities and trade routes. He would push the Turkish frontier back hundreds of miles. None of this would have been possible if the Pechenegs had remained a threat in the Balkans. Beroia secured John's western frontier, allowing him to focus eastward. The Varangian Guards. Performance at that battle was therefore not just a tactical success. It was a strategic turning point that enabled Byzantine recovery. The battle also demonstrated the continuing evolution of medieval warfare. The Pecheneg tactics, based on horse archery and mobility, represented traditional steppe warfare that had dominated Eurasia for centuries. The Varangian tactics, based on heavy armour and shock combat, represented the emerging European model that would eventually triumph. At Beroia, these two systems clashed directly. The mobility and firepower of steppe warriors versus the armour and discipline of heavy infantry. The outcome was decisive. The Varangians had absorbed everything the Pechenegs could deliver and then destroyed them in close combat. This pattern would repeat throughout the medieval period. Heavy cavalry and heavy infantry, when properly employed, could defeat light cavalry archers. The key was discipline. The key was armour. The key was refusing to break under arrow fire, closing to melee range, and then using superior protection and firepower to overwhelm the lighter-equipped nomads. The Mongols would later prove that horse archers could still win when commanded by military genius and supported by proper logistics. But against typical opponents, the armoured warrior was becoming dominant. The age of the steppe nomad was ending. The age of the knight and the man-at-arms was beginning. The Varangian Guard continued to serve the Byzantine emperors for another 2 centuries after Beroia. They fought in John's campaigns in Anatolia and Syria. They participated in the defence of Constantinople against multiple attacks. They guarded successive emperors through periods of prosperity and crisis. Their reputation remained formidable. Byzantine writers continued to describe them as axe-bearing barbarians whose loyalty and ferocity were unmatched. Foreign visitors to Constantinople regularly commented on the impressive guards who stood watch at the palace, huge warriors carrying massive axes, silent and intimidating. The Guard's decline began in the 13th century as the Byzantine Empire itself declined. The disaster of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Crusaders captured and sacked Constantinople, devastated the empire. The Varangian Guard fought heroically in the city's defence, but they could not prevent the catastrophe. Many were killed. The survivors fled with the Byzantine government to Nicaea. When the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople in 1261, the Varangian Guard returned, but they were never the same. Their numbers had dwindled. Recruitment from Scandinavia and England had dried up. The empire could no longer afford to pay them as generously. They were increasingly replaced by other mercenary units, including Catalan and Turkish troops. The last definitive mention of the Varangian Guard dates to the 14th century. By then, they were a shadow of their former strength, more ceremonial than combat effective. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the Varangian Guard as an institution had long since ceased to exist. But their legacy endured. They had served the Byzantine emperors for over 4 centuries. They had fought in dozens of campaigns across 3 continents. They had earned a reputation for loyalty and martial prowess that became legendary in both Eastern and Western chronicles. The Battle of Beroia stands as perhaps their finest moment. 480 warriors breaking a fortress that held tens of thousands, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed normal troops, fighting with an efficiency and brutality that shocked both allies and enemies, turning certain defeat into crushing victory through sheer violence and discipline. The Danish axes they wielded became symbols of their power. Byzantine poets wrote of the terrible sound of those axes striking in battle, like thunder from a cloudless sky. Enemy soldiers reportedly felt physical fear at the sight of the Varangian Guard advancing, axes raised, knowing that death walked toward them in human form. Modern historians have debated the effectiveness of the Danish axe compared to other medieval weapons. Some argue that the two-handed axe left the wielder unprotected, vulnerable to counterattack. Others point out that Varangians often fought without shields, relying entirely on their armour and offensive power. Surely these critics suggest a sword and shield combination would have been more balanced. But these arguments miss the point. The Varangian Guard was not designed for dueling or balanced combat. They were designed to break through fortifications, to smash enemy formations, to deliver overwhelming violence at critical moments. For these purposes, the Danish axe was perfect. The long reach allowed them to strike over or through defensive obstacles. The heavy blade could cut through materials that would stop swords. The psychological impact of facing axe-wielding giants was itself a weapon. The Varangians were not fencers. They were human siege engines. They were shock troops who absorbed casualties and delivered devastation. At Beroia, this design philosophy proved correct. The Varangians had broken through the wagon fortress using their axes in ways that no other troops could have duplicated. They had turned the battle at exactly the moment it threatened to fail. They had justified every excessive coin spent on their salaries and equipment. Emperor John II recognised this. After the battle, he publicly praised the Varangian Guard and rewarded them generously. He understood that he ruled an empire surrounded by enemies, that threats could emerge from any direction at any time, and that having an elite force of absolutely loyal, superbly skilled warriors was worth almost any cost. The Pechenegs learned this lesson too late. They had crossed the Danube expecting easy plunder. They had outnumbered the Byzantines 10-1. They had fortified their position behind the strongest field fortifications known to medieval warfare. They had fought with skill and courage, and they had been destroyed. Destroyed by an empire that could afford to maintain elite foreign mercenaries. Destroyed by an emperor young enough to take personal risks but wise enough to employ his forces correctly. Destroyed by 480 axe-bearing warriors who simply refused to stop. The Byzantine chroniclers who recorded the battle struggled to describe the violence adequately. Nikitas Choniats called it one of the most frightful and terrifying battles ever fought. He wrote of the wagon folk falling by the thousands. He described the scene as a bloodbath, with the Romans swarming into the Pecheneg camp once the Varangians had broken through, turning organised battle into massacre. Other sources mention the emperor's wound, sustained early in the battle but fought through to the end. They describe John directing operations from his saddle even as blood poured from his injured leg, refusing medical treatment until victory was assured. This image of the wounded emperor still commanding his troops, still driving the assault forward, became part of Byzantine imperial mythology. The sources also mention the immense booty captured. The Pechenegs had been carrying the accumulated plunder from their raids across Thrace. They had livestock, trade goods, gold, silver, weapons, armour, everything valuable they had collected during their invasion. All of it fell into Byzantine hands. More valuable than gold, though, were the thousands of prisoners. In an empire chronically short of military manpower, these captive Pechenegs represented years of service. Once enrolled in Byzantine units, they would fight against the empire's enemies. Their knowledge of steppe warfare would be useful against Turks and other nomadic peoples. Their horses and equipment would enhance Byzantine cavalry forces. This was the brutal logic of medieval warfare. Defeated enemies became resources. Their deaths in battle eliminated threats. Their capture and service provided benefits. Either way, the empire profited. John understood this completely. He was a realist, who recognized that sentiment had no place in strategic calculations. But he was also a Christian emperor who understood mercy. The Pecheneg prisoners who cooperated were treated relatively well. They were not enslaved. They were given opportunities to serve and prove themselves. Many eventually integrated fully into Byzantine society. Their descendants would be indistinguishable from other Byzantine subjects within 2 or 3 generations. This policy of integration was pragmatic but also humane by medieval standards. Many other rulers would have simply executed all prisoners or sold them as slaves. John chose a middle path that benefited both the empire and the defeated enemy. the Varangian Guard, having performed their duty at Beroia, returned to Constantinople with the rest of the army. They marched in triumph through the streets of the capital, citizens lining the route to cheer. The emperor rode at the head of the column, his wounded leg bandaged but visible, a mark of his personal courage. Behind him marched the Varangians, axes carried on their shoulders, armour battered and blood-stained, but spirits high. They had earned their reputation again. The next generation of Varangians would hear the stories of Beroia, how outnumbered Byzantine forces had destroyed a massive enemy army, how the Varangian Guard had broken the unbreakable wagon fortress, how their axes had cut through wood and flesh and bone until nothing remained but Byzantine victory. These stories would be passed down through the Guard's ranks for decades. New recruits from Scandinavia and England would be told about Beroia during their training. Veterans would describe the battle to younger warriors. The event would become part of the Guard's identity, an example of what they were capable of achieving. And when future emperors needed the Varangian Guard, when they faced seemingly impossible military challenges, they would remember Beroia. They would remember that 480 axe-bearing warriors had once changed the course of history. They would remember that loyalty, discipline, and brutal violence, when properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. The Battle of Beroia in 1122 was not the largest battle of the medieval period. It was not the most strategically significant. But it demonstrated principles of warfare that remain relevant across centuries: the value of elite troops, the importance of proper tactical employment, the decisive impact of shock action at critical moments, the psychological effects of reputation and intimidation, the brutal reality that sometimes wars are won by whoever is willing to endure more, to sacrifice more, to kill more efficiently. The Varangian Guard understood these principles instinctively. They had been recruited from cultures that valued martial prowess above almost everything else. Norse and Anglo-Saxon societies honoured the warrior. To fight well, to stand firm, to die bravely, these were the highest achievements a man could accomplish. In Byzantine service, these cultural values found perfect expression. The emperors paid generously, the enemies were worthy, the battles were frequent. A man could make his fortune, earn eternal glory, and die in combat that mattered. What more could a warrior want? So they fought. They fought at Beroia and 100 other battlefields whose names are lost to history. They stood guard over emperors whose policies they did not understand and could not influence. They bled and died for a civilization not their own, in service of causes that meant little to them personally. But they fought well. They fought with a dedication and skill that earned respect from everyone who witnessed it. They proved that money, properly applied, to skilled and motivated warriors, could purchase loyalty and effectiveness that native troops often could not match. The Pechenegs learned this the hard way. So would many other enemies of Byzantium over the following centuries. The axe-bearing Guard would become legendary. The Danish axes would become symbols of imperial power, and the memory of Beroia would endure as proof that sometimes 480 determined warriors are enough to change the world. The Varangian Guard's compensation was legendary throughout the medieval world. They received extraordinarily high wages and were always given the lion's share of army loot. But more remarkable was a unique privilege. Upon the death of an emperor, they were ritually given the right to take as much gold from the treasury as they could carry with 2 hands, the emperor's last gift to his loyal guards. This tradition created fortunes. Norse sagas tell of warriors returning home after years of Varangian service, their longships loaded with gold. One saga describes a son who enlisted in the Guard and returned years later with a vessel full of gold coins, bestowed by what they called the King of Greece for meritorious deeds. These returning warriors often became chieftains or jarls in their homelands, wealthy beyond imagination by Scandinavian standards. The stories of Varangian wealth spread throughout northern Europe. Young men from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and after 1066 from England dreamed of joining the Guard. They called Constantinople Miklagard, the great city, and spoke of it with reverence mixed with avarice. The journey was dangerous, requiring travel through hostile territories, but the potential rewards made the risk worthwhile. The recruitment process was informal but selective. Byzantine agents would search port cities for compatriots, distributed wine and presents, and painted serving the emperor in the brightest colours. During the Crusades, entire groups of pilgrims and crusaders passing through Constantinople were recruited. When the Count of the Orkney Islands passed through with 6 ships during the Second Crusade, all his men were enticed away. The Count received lavish gifts and returned home by land, his entire crew having joined the Guard. The Varangians who arrived in Constantinople found themselves in a city unlike anything in their experience. Constantinople in the 11th and 12th centuries was the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated urban centre in the Christian world. Its population exceeded 500,000. Its walls stretched for miles. Its palaces and churches gleamed with gold and marble. The Hagia Sophia, the great church of Holy Wisdom, was a building so vast and magnificent that northern visitors believed it could only have been constructed by angels. The Varangians were housed in well-maintained barracks close to the imperial palace, ensuring they were always ready to protect the emperor. The barracks were luxurious by medieval, military standards, private sleeping quarters, regular meals featuring meat, fish, bread, wine and beer, access to bathhouses, medical care from Byzantine physicians whose knowledge far exceeded anything available in northern Europe. The Varangians adapted to Byzantine life while maintaining their own identity. They wore Byzantine armour over their tunics but kept their Nordic weapons. They learned enough Greek to function, but spoke Norse or Old English among themselves. They attended Orthodox Christian services, most having converted upon joining the Guard, but their Christianity retained distinctly northern flavours. Some even left their mark quite literally. 2 Varangians named Halfdan and Ara carved runic inscriptions into the marble railings of the Hagia Sophia. These carvings can still be seen today, Viking graffiti preserved for 1,000 years. When off duty, Varangians would fill the city's taverns and drink till the morning, giving rise to their popular nickname, the Emperor's Wine Sacks. Byzantine citizens viewed them with a mixture of respect and exasperation. They were formidable warriors whose loyalty was absolute. They were also rowdy foreigners who drank heavily, fought in taverns, and generally disturbed the peace when not on duty. But when duty called, they were unmatched. The Varangian Guard was only used in battle during critical moments, or where the battle was most fierce. They were too valuable to waste on routine operations. They served as the Emperor's personal bodyguard, standing watch at the palace, accompanying him during public appearances, ready to die protecting him if necessary. Their loyalty was legendary. Byzantine chroniclers noted that the Varangians regarded loyalty to the emperors and the protection of their persons as a family tradition, a kind of sacred trust that they preserved inviolate and would never brook the slightest hint of betrayal. This was not exaggeration. Throughout Byzantine history, when emperors were overthrown by rivals, it was almost always native Byzantine troops who betrayed them. The Varangians fought to the end, loyal to the man they had sworn to protect regardless of politics. There was an important distinction in their oath. The Varangians swore loyalty to the person of the emperor, not to the imperial office itself. If a legitimate emperor was overthrown and replaced, the Varangians might transfer their allegiance to the new ruler, but they would not participate in the overthrow. They would fight for their emperor until he released them from their oath, was killed, or ordered them to stand down. This created occasional complications. During Byzantine civil wars and succession crises, the Varangian Guard sometimes found themselves in awkward positions, uncertain which claimant to support. Generally, they supported whoever currently sat on the throne in Constantinople, on the principle that possession was legitimacy. But when Emperor Alexius III snuck away from Constantinople, with his treasures the Varangians were persuaded by the imperial treasurer to free the blinded opponent Isaac II from jail, recognizing that the fleeing emperor had effectively abandoned his position. The career of Harald Hardrada, later King of Norway, illustrates the complexities of Varangian service. Harald joined the Guard in the 1030s and served for over a decade. He fought in Sicily against the Normans, in Bulgaria against rebels, and in numerous other campaigns. He enriched himself substantially, partly through legitimate spoils of war, and partly through questionable means. Harald was finally thrown into prison for embezzlement, along with 2 Icelanders who served as officers in the Guard. The Guard, who considered such misappropriations as their given right, was apparently outraged. The new Emperor Michael V, seeking to reduce Varangian influence, replaced his bodyguards with Scythian slaves. This was a fatal miscalculation. When Michael V ousted the brother of the deceased emperor and the Dowager Empress Zoe, he incited huge popular uprisings in Constantinople, which some Varangians apparently joined. The people of Constantinople, enraged by the treatment of the beloved Empress Zoe, rose in revolt. The Varangians, sullen in their barracks and angry about their imprisoned officers and lost privileges, sided with the mob. Michael V was overthrown, blinded, and sent to a monastery. The Varangians were restored to their positions, their privileges returned. This episode was exceptional. Generally, the Varangians remained above Byzantine politics. They did not care about aristocratic factions or theological disputes. They cared about honour, gold, and loyalty to their sworn lord. This political neutrality made them invaluable to emperors who could trust no one else. The training regime for new Varangian recruits was intensive. Veterans would drill new arrivals in formation fighting, teaching them to move as a unit despite their individualistic northern backgrounds. They practiced with their axes for hours daily, building the strength and endurance needed for sustained combat. They learned Byzantine military signals and commands. They studied the tactics of the empire's various enemies. Some citizens of Constantinople visited the hippodrome during Varangian trainings and exercises. These training sessions became public spectacles. Citizens would gather to watch the northern giants practice their axe work, marvelling at the power and precision of their strikes. The Varangians would demonstrate formations, charging and withdrawing in perfect unison, their axes swinging in coordinated arcs. The Byzantine military system in which the Varangians operated was sophisticated. Byzantine armies strategically combined infantry, cavalry, and artillery forces to maximize their effectiveness across various combat scenarios. Infantry would countermarch to make a refuse center, while the cavalry would hold or advance, to envelop or outflank the enemy. This was similar to tactics employed by Hannibal at Cannae centuries earlier. The Varangian Guard fit into this system as heavy shock infantry. Their role was to hold critical positions, to break through fortified defences to stop enemy attacks that threatened to overwhelm lighter troops. The role of heavy infantrymen drawn up in serried ranks was largely defensive, constituting a bulwark which could resist enemy heavy cavalry charges and formed a movable battlefield base from which the cavalry and other more mobile troops could mount attacks, and behind which they could rally. At Beroia, this tactical doctrine was executed perfectly. Emperor John positioned his forces with infantry in the centre, cavalry on the wings. When the Pecheneg horse archers attacked, the Byzantine cavalry struck from both flanks, forcing the nomads back into their wagon fortress. The infantry advanced but could not break through the wooden walls. This was the critical moment. The entire assault threatened to stall. Byzantine soldiers were dying in heaps at the wagon line without making progress. John then committed his strategic reserve. The Varangian Guard moved forward, not rushing but advancing with deliberate purpose. They reached the wagon line and simply went to work. Axes rose and fell, wood splintered, wagons collapsed. The Pechenegs shot arrows, stabbed with spears, fought desperately. The Varangians absorbed the punishment and continued destroying the fortifications. This was the essence of shock infantry tactics. Accept casualties, maintain formation, complete the mission. The Varangians were willing to pay the price that other troops could not. They trusted their armour to protect them from most wounds. They trusted their brothers to avenge them if they fell. They trusted their axes to destroy whatever stood before them. When the wagon walls finally broke, the waiting Byzantine troops poured through. The Varangians led the way, cutting paths through the defending Pechenegs. Their axes, designed for maximum impact, were devastating in close combat. The Varangians, armed with their distinctive Danish axes, hacked their way through the Pecheneg wagon fort, collapsing the Pecheneg position and causing a general rout in their camp. The battle devolved into massacre. The Pechenegs, trapped within their own fortress, had nowhere to retreat. The Byzantine cavalry surrounded the entire lega, cutting off escape routes. The Varangians and other Byzantine infantry worked through the camp methodically, killing or capturing everyone they encountered. The Pecheneg families, the non-combatants who had travelled with the warriors, were seized as prisoners. The livestock, supplies, gold and weapons were claimed as loot. The Varangians, as elite troops, received premium shares of the plunder. This was their reward for bearing the heaviest casualties, for breaking the defences that others could not penetrate. Some would use their share to retire, returning to Scandinavia or England with enough gold to live comfortably. Others would remain in service, seeking more battles and more glory. The psychological impact of the Varangian assault at Beroia extended far beyond that single battle. Word spread throughout the steppe peoples of the northern warriors who could not be stopped. The Pechenegs had been considered among the most formidable warriors of the Eurasian steppes. They had defeated Byzantine forces multiple times. They had destroyed armies and sacked cities. Yet at Beroia, they had been annihilated by an outnumbered Byzantine force, primarily because of 480 axe-wielding foreigners who refused to break. This reputation for invincibility became its own weapon. In subsequent battles, enemies who recognized the Varangian Guard would sometimes refuse to engage them directly. Byzantine commanders learned to use the Guard's presence as a psychological tool, positioning them prominently where enemies could see them, knowing that their reputation alone might cause opponents to lose heart. The Varangians themselves took pride in this fear they inspired. They maintained their appearance carefully. Their armour was always polished. Their axes were kept razor sharp. Their formations were always precise. They understood that part of their power came from the image they projected. An image of invincible warriors who could not be stopped, who absorbed any punishment, who killed with mechanical efficiency. This image was carefully cultivated but fundamentally accurate. The Varangians were genuinely elite warriors, selected from the best fighters in Northern Europe, trained constantly, equipped with the finest weapons and armour available, and motivated by gold, honour, and an oath they would die rather than break. At Beroia, all these elements came together. The right troops in the right place at the right moment, led by an emperor who understood how to use them. The result was a victory that secured the Byzantine Empire's northern frontier for decades and destroyed a threat that had plagued the empire for over a century. The Varangian Guard would continue to serve for another 2 centuries. They would fight in dozens more battles. They would defend Constantinople against crusaders, Turks, and rebels. They would guard dozens of emperors, some wise, some foolish, some heroic, some cowardly. Through it all, they would maintain their reputation for loyalty and ferocity. But Beroia remained special. It was the battle where they proved beyond all doubt that they were worth every gold coin paid for their service, where they demonstrated that properly employed elite troops could change the course of history, where 480 warriors broke a fortress that held tens of thousands, and in doing so saved an empire. The Danish axes they carried, those fearsome weapons that could split a man from shoulder to hip, became legendary. Byzantine poets would write of thunder. Enemy soldiers would hear that distinctive sound and know death approached. The axes became symbols of Byzantine power, proof that the empire could field warriors to match any enemy. And the warriors who wielded those axes, these Norsemen and Englishmen far from their homelands, fighting for an emperor whose language many barely spoke, in defence of a civilization not their own, they became legends themselves. The Varangian Guard, the axe-bearers, the emperor's wine sacks, the men who laughed at death and broke the unbreakable, the foreigners who held together an empire with nothing but loyalty, discipline, and the willingness to swing their axes until either they or their enemies ceased to exist. At Beroia, they swung their axes, and an entire nation ceased to exist.